Thanks, Manshila. Before we open up for a round of questions, I thought, just let me read to you, some words of PG in this book, this unauthorized biography. In it, he's quoted as saying, "No one can ever be satisfied that one knows it all. My life has been about learning and growing and adapting through the learning. I'll have to retire at some stage from formal politics and yet look for other ways within my ability and health of contributing. You can retire from a job, but you can't retire as an activist." It then goes on. He says he'd like to be remembered as just the activist who grew up on the streets of central Durban, who had the opportunity to contribute as a lifelong activist to building the changing South Africa, but also to build the institutions of democracy as one small contribution among many, many others. And how does he think he'll be remembered? Well, that depends on how you write the book. He laughs and then becomes serious. Actually, I think it will vary depending on what happens to the rest of my life. For the last 18 months, I've taken a lot of knocks for doing what we had to do in respect of SAA, for example. From an anti-corruption figure, I suddenly became stupid. And I was horrified the last 3 days to read the vitriol that was being spewed out, particularly on X. It was just the most disgusting content. I'm, however, very happy that I think this morning and going forward, on all of the mainstream media, there's been a very different appreciation of Pravin. Some critical, and perhaps rightfully so in specific areas, but not the kind of just negative commentary for the sake of negative commentary that came before his death. And I hope going forward that when we introspect his life, it will be done on the basis of fact, not on fiction that I think that you would have heard in some of the radio stations this morning. So, just to repeat, the funeral takes place in Durban on Thursday. It is an official funeral, will be followed by a private cremation, but the finer details of that will probably come from the presidency over the next few days. The family have also asked for the media and the general public, for those who want to go and pay their respects, to do that after 3 today, and also when it is no longer possible, to really respect their time and all that they will be going through over the next few days. Lastly, across the length and breadth of South Africa, you don't need permission to celebrate PG's life. Do it in the ways that you think is most befitting and is within the ability of the organizations and the people there. Because I think his life is worth celebrating across the length and breadth of this country, not just in the formal events that will mark the next few weeks. The foundation and others will look at hosting a memorial event in Johannesburg next weekend, but again, there's a range of consultations that we would have to go through, but definitely next weekend there will be a memorial event. On that note, I'm hoping you've had too much of content so that there's not any question, but in the event that there is, can I ask that the questions and the comments be short and to the point? The speeches we've already had now. Any hands? I thought as much.
Thank you very much. My name is Moloko Moloto from ENCA. Just 2 questions. The first one, I'm directing directing it to Mr. Mcebisi Jonas because you worked with him as his Deputy Minister of Finance. And it's also sparked by the remarks that you made there to say that had Mr. Gordhan not, if he didn't fight, perhaps the Guptas, Mr. Zuma would still be in power. Looking at the work of the State Capture Commission and what you might be aware of, things that perhaps as the public we may not be privy to, is it your considered view that much has been done perhaps to reverse particularly the effects of state capture, or do you still get a sense that the tentacles of state capture remain? Given the fact that the Guptas have not been held accountable in any form or shape. The next question would relate to, and you just touched on it, unfortunately we won't avoid it that much. The statement issued by the economic freedom fighters now, who are, of course, we know that they have always been, their views against Mr. Gordhan are well known, but they just issued a statement today where they are saying he was the embodiment of what they call greed, corruption, and exploitation. I think perhaps, Mr. Manuel, he succeeded you, and perhaps Mr. Maharaj, if you can have a bite there.
Okay, so let's just see if there's any other question, and then we will take responses to them. Thank you very much for those.
Thank you. Thanks, Nishan. My question is to Minister Manuel, former Minister Manuel. My name is Peter Retoy from News 24. Can you perhaps just elaborate a little bit how difficult it is to rescue state-owned enterprises given the situation that we find ourselves in? How deep do you think is the damage that has been done, and how difficult a task is it to try and recover them given the constraints that we have on the fiscus at the moment? Thank you.
All right. Let me take one more there, and then we'll just take the responses, and I'll come back to you as a second round.
Good afternoon, Ziluko Mhlaba from Newsroom Africa. To pressure, some of the speakers here have spoken about the support Mr. Gordhan had from his family, but also the strain the family took when he was under attack. Can you share some of the critical moments where the family took such strain, and did the family at any point consider asking him to resign from public service? At the back of those. But also generally maybe to Mr. Manuel and Mr. Jonas as well, looking at where the country is right now and the fight Mr. Gordhan was fighting, in terms of trying to fight back against state capture. Are you happy with where things are currently? Was his fight worth it when you look at the current state?
Okay, thank you very much. If we can just get, we'll come back to this, to another round. Mcebisi, a good number of questions to you, and then to Trevor, to Prayusha, there's something very specific to you. But Mke, you want to start? You want to do it from here?
It's better.
Yeah, all the mics are here.
It hides a lot of things now.
Yeah.
Well, the question, firstly, I think we should probably understand the complexity of state capture in particular and corruption in general. I think it's a very complex process. And part of it centrally involved the disestablishment of the state, basically, and state institutions. And if you kind of follow a lot of what PG used to talk about, it used to be the importance of institutions. So if you think about it, in that period, most of the institutions, key institutions, from NPA, the Hawks, the police, etc., but also key institutions like SARS, there was a major attack to weaken them. Now, evidence shows that projects like state capture succeed if you weaken government and therefore create vacuum. Because once you have vacuum, then you can actually continue doing whatever you want to do. The second part, I think they succeed if you have an ability to externalize the proceeds of crime. So you don't, if you don't have a channel for externalizing proceeds of crime, a state capture project normally fails. I mean, you've got examples across the continent and in other parts of the world. The effectiveness of being able to externalize proceeds of crime is another element of that. The third element that I think sometimes we have not really dealt with very well, is the fact that is what many people call ethnic stacking. That actually it succeeds because you build almost other beneficiaries away from the real perpetrators of crime, of the crime. So you would find that in state capture, if you take ESCOM, you also have, you'll have the main takers, but you'll have a series of coal, people involved in coal, small and whatever, still beneficiaries to the process. And therefore it covers the core of the process, so to speak. Now why I'm saying this, I'm saying this because I think sometimes when we analyze the success or failure of how government has dealt with state capture and corruption, we actually focus on the arrest of the particular individuals. That being said, I think there has been progress in some instances. I think some institutions have been rebuilt, particularly if you think about the NPAs, the Hawks, etc. There's been a lot of work to rebuild. Now that has happened in a context where there are fiscal constraints. So again, you still have other challenges about how you finance this, etc., which becomes a big problem and impediment in what you do. The second point is that these because they are complex and they involve high-profile people, the worst thing you can do is to have somebody try it and try it wrongly and win the case. Because the signal that you send to society, and we have a case, of course, right now in South Africa, where the progress not only has been slow, but also I think sometimes the packaging of the charges and whatever, it is end up people walking away. And that's actually a dangerous thing in these kinds of cases. So what I'm saying, there is progress, but I think we could do better, and we should be doing better. Part of the reason why I think we're not doing better is the mobilization of society around state capture and corruption. Because if there's anything that happened after the Gupta period, has been the demobilization of society, effectively. The whole kind of movement that was like actively looking at these things disappeared. There's also been the weakening of media in some instances, where actually an attack was like waged against media in the manner in which they kind of may expose some of these things, as it were. And then I'm saying that I think moving forward, if we're to strengthen the fight, we've got to think about means and way of remobilizing civil society, remobilizing citizens around these things against state capture and corruption. But also I think we must continue with the project of rebuilding the state, which is probably a more fundamental element of what we need to do. And I guess to summarize, a lot has been done, but a lot more could have been done, I would argue. But also must also appreciate another element of state capture. It was primarily a political project. The extent of political reform happening in political parties is important. Whether political parties have moved politically in how they look at state capture and understand state capture is as important as arresting people. Because if you have the fundamental theory that guides political parties is fundamentally flawed, it therefore creates the theoretical basis or the moral justification of doing these things and continuing to do these things. You also have like other problems around how empowerment happens in South Africa. State wealth creation in South Africa remains a project of the state. And I think it's important that as we think about restructuring, we think holistically about all of these things and all of these elements. I think it's not a short-term project, it is a long-term project. And in that long-term project, we've got to change politics also. Because I think if you have the politics as they are today, I can assure you that in many ways, many political parties' survival is anchored into these forms of extraction, as it were. You've got to change that. You've got to change that. The ethos of the political system should not be what many people will call primitive accumulation. It should be something else. It should be the ethos of political parties should be principles, not primitive accumulation, extraction from government and for parties to survive. And if you look at the past elections, the amount of money spent by political parties, and I can dare say that if you do a proper audit of where it comes from, you would reach uncomfortable conclusions. I end there, sorry.
Sarah?
Thank you very much. That statement from the EFF, was it just a statement of irony? Because greed and corruption defines what the EFF leadership is about. The problem that they've had with Pravin Gordhan and everybody at SARS is that SARS has to go after tobacco smugglers. Now, don't ask me why EFF is so attached to tobacco smugglers and whether some of the leaders live in the yards of tobacco smugglers. Don't ask me any of that. But there's a fundamental problem with a party that will not disclose who funds it and to what extent, in spite of legislative requirements, of a party that wants to participate in taking decisions that impact on the lives of all people. They have major rallies that have all kinds of gadgetry, rising stages for the one who defines himself as commander-in-chief, hasn't commanded anything, but he calls himself that. And the problem for them was always that they were up against SARS. Now, anybody who knew Pravin, anybody who met Pravin, would be able to confirm that his life, his lifestyle, and in fact, the references that Priyasha read to the speech at the NIC is completely against every aspect of greed, corruption, and vanity. I think history will judge that issue. On the question of SOEs and what it will cost to put together again, it's a very difficult question. You know, leave SOEs for a moment and just look at SARS, because at the beginning, when SARS was being built, you could go to people who were on the up in their careers and say, democracy is fundamentally important, leave what you're doing. Join us, because this project to build a democracy is dependent on an institution like SARS. SARS needs your skills and acumen. Join us, even if it's for a short period. Join us. And that was, in fact, the magic that gave SARS the energy to be the revenue collector in the world. I referenced this morning the fact that in the early 2000s, there was a request from the IRS in the United States to SARS to assist them to build a better inland revenue service in the United States. The IRS has been the subject of movies and so on. But SARS became the paragon of what was possible anywhere, not just in developing countries. when state capture happened and certain people were put in, at the same time, those who had the skills and commitment to democracy left the organization. Not all of them, but many of them did. And so part of the project at SARS now is to attract skills again and rebuild its presence in society. The same thing happens in the state-owned enterprises. So you can look at the balance sheet, and Transnet published results this week. You look at their debt service costs, you look at their debt pile, you look at some of the decisions that were taken along the way that don't inform a state-owned logistics company into the future. These are big issues that happen in the environment. And part of what happened, and this, you can go through the pages of the Zondo Commission. Somebody will appear as the chair of this state-owned enterprise today. Tomorrow there are other people there. So the norms of corporate governance were never brought into application in the state-owned enterprises. And part of what the boards have to do now is rebuild ab initio, except that they're not starting at ground zero. They're starting in a very deep hole of debt that has been accumulated. And that, I think, is going to be an ongoing challenge. You look, I've mentioned Transnet, you look at the state of our ports at the moment, you look at the impact not just on our exports and imports, but upstream from that, you look at the agricultural sector, or many sectors. You look at what is happening with Richards Bay coal terminal and the kilometers, tens of kilometers of trucks. Now you have to ask who's come to own those trucks and who would resist the idea that you should have an effective coal rail system that takes coal from Ermelo to Richards Bay. You've got to deal with all of those things. They're complex, they'll be embedded throughout society. It's going to be a big question to them. The last question, Sean, is, was it worth the struggle? The struggle is not linear, you know. It's not a few steps in one direction, because what has happened in the project, and this is in fact the state capture project, was to drive back the gains, because the gains would be measured in the lives of everyday people. That reference that Pravin made to improving on the quality of life of people. When you feed corruption, you take skills off, you take opportunities, you take food off the tables of poor people. And so that struggle can never be in vain. It's a continuous struggle. What we hope is that the state will be able to protect the gains that are made and continue to advance. Because now, every time you've had a major pushback, like you had, and I'm going to call it what it is, the Zuma years, you've got to start and build it up again when the resources are not actually what they were when we started from 1994. That's a big challenge we have. And the project now, and these are the words that come through from everybody who's worked on these issues in the detail with Pravin Gordhan, is that you can't give up that fight. You can't give up that fight. There has to be an even deeper commitment to ensure that we can deliver the objective of a democracy that impacts in the lives of the people is a commitment that we can never relent on. Thanks.
Just before Priyasha comes, so White Golf HF94WGGP, you're blocking somebody's gate. I'm not going to look at you as you walk out to sort this out, but please go and sort it out. Priyash?
Unlike the leaders on this panel, this is my first time doing this, so please bear with me while I attempt to answer your question. I think with respect to my dad, he was a very disciplined cadre of the movement, and I'm going to follow in his footsteps and not say anything out of turn, as upsetting as it was to hear what the EFF has released. with specific references to things that were difficult that we endured as a family starting late 2015 and early 2016. I think getting 27 questions a few days before delivering a national budget speech would stick out as one of them. Reading in the newspaper that your innocent father might be led away in handcuffs, NPA charges that were filed, taken down, incessant attacks by a public prosecutor who lost every single one of those cases, and all that was achieved was wasting of taxpayer money. Going up against forces in your own party, like was said earlier, was all very distressing for him. But we didn't make any singular decision to stay, and I say we because my father consulted us as a family with before every decision he took. And it wasn't his sole decision to stay in the public arena. He was told and asked by many different people to stay, to fight, because the country needed him. And as a family, we were willing to make that sacrifice. My parents are both political activists and freedom fighters. And as difficult as those attacks were, knowing that my father is an incorruptible, honest man who has only ever served the public to the best of his ability, as difficult as those attacks were to endure, we endured them for the country. And my father does not give up. He's a soldier, he is a fighter, and at no point was there ever a decision to step away until he had felt that in the current role that he was in, he had made the contribution that he could, and he was looking for alternative ways to do that in different forms after his retirement.
I want to make a suggestion that those of the media who want to follow up with any of the individuals here, please do that. People are available to do one-on-one interviews with you, but I'd like to pull this thing to a close if possible. We have extended it by almost 30 minutes. Just to thank members of the media for being here, to thank many of the veterans, Prema, Kamla, and everybody else who's here. Just your presence means a lot. And we will see many of you in Durban on Thursday. And to the family, we will walk with you for as long as is necessary. Thank you, everybody.